The Siberian wilderness stretched endlessly, an unforgiving land where winter held dominion over life. Snow-covered pines stood as silent sentinels, their branches sagging under the weight of ice. The only sound that broke the vast stillness was the distant howling of wolves, sharp, lonely cries carried by the freezing wind. Nestled in the heart of this frozen expanse stood a modest wooden cabin, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. It belonged to Elena Volkov, a 75-year-old widow who had lived in solitude for over a decade. To many, her life seemed impossibly lonely. No family, no neighbors, only the wilderness for company. But to Elena, the stillness was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos of the world she had left behind. Her hands, wrinkled with time and hard labor, gripped a porcelain teacup as she stared into the flickering fire. She had learned long ago how to read the language of the forest, the shifting winds, the patterns of snowfall, the warning signs of an approaching storm. But on this particular morning, as she listened to the world outside, something felt wrong. Then she heard it. A sound that did not belong. A faint, high-pitched whimper. Elena froze, her heart quickening. It was not the cry of a bird, nor the mournful call of a wolf. It was something small. Something fragile. She set down her cup and moved toward the door, wrapping herself in her thickest coat. The moment she stepped outside, the icy air bit into her skin like tiny daggers. The temperature had plummeted overnight, reaching a deadly -45°C, the kind of cold that could steal a life in minutes. She followed the sound, her boots crunching over the thick snow. The wind howled through the trees, but the cries persisted, growing louder as she approached the old storage shed at the edge of her property. Her breath fogged in front of her as she reached out and unlatched the heavy wooden door. Inside, curled up in the farthest corner, were 3 tiny bear cubs. Their fur was dusted with frost, their tiny bodies trembling violently. Their eyes, wide with fear, locked onto hers. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had spent years in this wilderness, but never had she seen anything like this. Bears did not stray this close to human dwellings, especially not without their mother. A terrible realization dawned upon her. These cubs were alone. And in the merciless Siberian winter, alone meant certain death. A choice against nature. Elena hesitated. Every instinct, every rule of survival told her to walk away. Nature had its own laws, and interfering with them could be dangerous. Bears were wild creatures, not pets. They would grow, and in time, their instincts would drive them to hunt, to survive as they were meant to. But then the smallest cub let out a tiny, broken whimper. A sound so full of fear and helplessness that it struck something deep within her, something human. Ignoring logic, ignoring the voices of reason in her head, Elena stepped forward. The cubs flinched but were too weak to run. Slowly, carefully, she knelt beside them. She could feel their tiny bodies trembling as she reached out. One by one, she gathered them into her arms. They barely weighed anything, just fragile bundles of fur and bones, struggling to hold on to life. With slow, deliberate steps, she carried them inside. The warmth of the cabin hit them instantly, and the cubs let out soft, pitiful noises as they adjusted to the sudden change. Elena placed them near the fireplace, rubbing their frozen bodies to restore circulation. Their fur was stiff with ice, their paws raw from the cold. She knew they needed food. But what did you feed a bear cub? Instinct guided her. She heated up goat's milk mixed with honey, testing the temperature carefully before offering it to the smallest cub. At first, they hesitated, their bodies too weak to respond. Then, little by little, they began to drink. Elena sighed in relief. That night, as the storm raged outside, she sat by the fire, watching over them. She named them Yuri, Anya, and Mikhail. And though she did not yet realize it, Her life had changed forever. The days that followed. The following days were a test of patience and resilience. Raising bear cubs was nothing like raising ordinary animals. They were unpredictable, wild instincts fighting against their dependence on her. At first, they were timid, huddling together, watching her with cautious eyes. But soon, they began to trust. Yuri, the largest of the three, was bold and curious. He explored every inch of the cabin. Sniffing at furniture, knocking over pots and cups with his oversized paws. Anya was cautious but affectionate. She would press close to Elena whenever she sat by the fire, her round black eyes full of quiet intelligence. Mikhail, the smallest, was the most fragile. He had nearly frozen to death when she found them, and his recovery was slow. Elena often had to hold him against her chest, warming him with her body heat. Despite herself, she began to love them. She knew it was dangerous. She knew they did not belong to her. But as the weeks passed, they became a part of her world. Spring's inevitable goodbye. Winter faded into spring, and the time came for them to leave. Elena knew this moment would come. They were growing, stronger, wilder. Their instincts were calling them back to where they belonged. One morning, she stepped outside and opened the door. Yuri was the first to step forward, sniffing the air. Anya followed, her ears perked with curiosity. Mikhail lingered, pressing close to Elena one last time before following his siblings into the trees. Elena watched them go, her heart breaking and swelling at the same time. She had given them a chance. And now, they had returned to the wild. She thought she would never see them again. But fate had other plans. The first miracle. 2 years passed. Life returned to its familiar solitude. Elena went about her days as she always had, but deep inside, something had changed. She no longer felt alone. She often found herself looking toward the forest, wondering where they were. If they had survived. If they still remembered her. Then, one fateful winter, disaster struck. A terrible snowstorm blanketed the land, and Elena found herself in a desperate situation. Her firewood was running dangerously low. Without it, she would freeze to death before the week was over. With no choice, she set out into the forest. The cold was unforgiving. Each step felt heavier, her breath turning to ice in the air. But she pressed on, collecting whatever dry branches she could find. Then, disaster. A blizzard swept through, swallowing the forest in a wall of white. Elena turned, but her tracks had vanished. She was lost. The temperature was dropping rapidly. She could feel the strength leaving her body, her vision growing hazy. Then, through the snow, a massive shadow emerged. A bear. Her heart stopped. But as the figure stepped closer, her breath caught. It was Yuri. Fully grown. Towering. His fur dusted with snow, his eyes locked onto hers. Then, to her astonishment, Anya and Mikhail appeared. They had found her. And they had come to save her. The blizzard raged around Elena, its icy winds howling through the trees like vengeful spirits. Her body trembled violently, exhaustion weighing down on her like an invisible force. She had lived in the Siberian wilderness for decades, surviving against nature's harshest trials, but this time, she knew, if she didn't find shelter soon, she wouldn't make it. Then, they appeared. 3 massive figures emerged from the swirling snow, their dark silhouettes cutting through the white void. For a fleeting moment, fear seized her, bears. But then, her weary mind registered what her heart already knew. It was Yuri, Anya, and Mikhail. Her cubs. Only they weren't cubs anymore. They had grown into towering, powerful bears. Their thick fur dusted with snow, their muscles rippling beneath the frost-covered coats. Their golden brown eyes, once filled with youthful innocence, now held something deeper, recognition. They hadn't forgotten her. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, freezing on her lashes. She had saved them once. Now, they had come to save her. The path to safety. Yuri was the first to move, stepping toward her with deliberate purpose. His warm breath billowed into the cold air as he nuzzled her shoulder gently, as if urging her to get up. Elena tried to stand, but her legs gave way. The cold had drained too much from her. Then, to her astonishment, Mikhail, once the smallest and weakest of the three, pressed himself against her, using his body to support her weight. Anya followed suit, positioning herself on Elena's other side. The message was clear. They weren't going to let her die. With slow, careful steps, they began to guide her through the snow-covered forest. Elena, too weak to question, let herself be led. She barely understood where they were taking her, but she trusted them completely. The journey was slow, exhausting. Every step felt like lifting a mountain. But whenever she stumbled, the bears would pause, waiting patiently. They didn't rush her. They didn't leave her behind. They protected her. The blizzard howled furiously around them. But they moved forward with a silent determination. Yuri took the lead, his massive body cutting through the wind like a shield, while Anya and Mikhail flanked her sides, keeping her steady. For what felt like an eternity, they walked. And then, the storm began to break. Through the thinning snow, Elena saw a familiar shape emerging in the distance. Her cabin. She let out a choked sob, her knees nearly buckling. They had led her home. They had saved her life. A night of unspoken understanding. As soon as they reached the porch, Elena collapsed onto the wooden steps, gasping for breath. The bears stood watching, their warm exhales visible in the cold air. She half expected them to leave, to disappear back into the wilderness. But they didn't. Instead, Yuri turned and began digging through the snow, uncovering a pile of fallen branches. He dragged a large log toward her cabin with ease. Elena's breath hitched in realization. They were bringing her firewood. One by one, Anya and Mikhail followed suit, gathering more logs from beneath the snow, piling them neatly by her door. Tears blurred Elena's vision. They remembered. They understood. They knew she had nearly frozen to death, and they wouldn't let it happen again. With trembling hands, she reached for the matches inside her coat pocket, lighting a fire in her small wood stove. The warmth seeped through her bones, chasing away the deadly chill. Outside, the three bears remained near the cabin, standing guard beneath the trees. They didn't enter. They didn't demand anything from her. They simply stayed. Elena sat by the fire, watching their massive forms through the frost-covered window. In that moment, she realized something profound. These weren't just wild animals. They were family. The years of protection. From that night onward, everything changed. The bears didn't return to the deep wilderness as she had expected. Instead, they remained within the forest surrounding her home, their presence an unspoken promise of watchful protection. They had returned not just to visit her, but to guard her. The local hunters noticed first. A group of poachers had been roaming the Siberian forests, hunting illegally. They had targeted Elena's land, assuming it was isolated, easy prey. But when they approached, something terrifying happened. The three bears emerged from the trees, standing like giants in the snow, their golden eyes burning with an unmistakable warning. The men, realizing they were being watched by creatures that clearly understood their presence, quickly abandoned their hunt. The rumors spread fast. The old widow in the forest is guarded by bears. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others knew better. The loggers were the next to test their luck. Illegal deforestation had been creeping toward Elena's land, with men arriving to clear trees for profit. But before they could even start, Yuri, Anya, and Mikhail appeared, this time not as silent watchers, but as an unstoppable force. The largest of the loggers, armed with a rifle, barely had time to lift his weapon before Yuri reared onto his hind legs. 7 feet tall. Towering. A force of nature. The gun never fired. The men fled, abandoning their equipment. Elena never saw them again. The fire that changed everything. For 5 years, the bears remained near her land. They never interfered unless there was a threat. But they never left her alone. Then came the fire. The Siberian summer had been unusually dry, turning the forest into a tinderbox. When the flames came, they moved fast. Elena woke to the choking scent of smoke. The sky outside her window burned a deep orange-red, and the heat was already licking at the edges of her cabin. She tried to gather what little she could, but she knew there was no escape. The roads were blocked. The fire was moving too quickly. She was trapped. Just as panic took hold, they came. Yuri. Anya. Mikhail. Through the thick smoke, their massive bodies emerged, fearless. Determined. This time, they didn't wait for her to follow. They grabbed her. Gently, but with absolute urgency, Yuri took her arm in his massive jaws, pulling her away from the cabin. Anya and Mikhail flanked her, steering her toward the only path untouched by fire. The heat was unbearable. The smoke blinded her. But they never let her fall. For hours, they guided her through the burning wilderness. When she stumbled, they waited. When the fire closed in, they found another way. By sunrise, they had led her to safety. The fire destroyed everything, her cabin, her land. But she had survived. Because of them. The last goodbye. The rescue teams found her near the riverbank, barely conscious. As they carried her away, she saw them one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees. Watching. Waiting. Their mission was complete. And just like that, they disappeared into the wilderness. Gone. Elena never saw them again. But their legacy remained. The news spread, a woman saved not once, but 3 times, by wild bears. Scientists debated. Some called it instinct, others called it impossible. But Elena knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was loyalty. It was family. And even now, when the winter winds howled through the trees, she sometimes swore she could hear them, moving through the forest. Watching. Protecting. And she knew. No matter where they had gone, they had never truly left her. The first snowfall of the season came early that year, blanketing the forest in a thick layer of pristine white. Elena stood on her porch. Wrapped in her heavy wool coat, her breath curling into the cold air. It had been almost a year since the fire, since the bears had led her to safety, and yet, she hadn't seen them since. Not once. She knew they were out there, somewhere deep within the Siberian wilderness, living their lives as nature intended. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left her. She had caught glimpses, large shadows moving through the trees at dusk, the faintest trace of paw prints near the edge of her land, even the occasional low rumble in the wind that sounded eerily like Boris's growl. She didn't need to see them to know they were watching. But then, one night, everything changed. A cry in the darkness. It was just past midnight when Elena woke to a sound she hadn't heard in years, a low, mournful wail, carried through the trees like a ghostly whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind. But as she sat up in bed, the sound came again, closer this time. It was unmistakable. A bear's call. Throwing on her coat, Elena grabbed her lantern and stepped out into the freezing night. The forest was silent except for the crunch of her boots against the snow. Her heart pounded with both fear and excitement. Could it be them? Had they returned? Then, at the edge of the clearing, she saw him. Boris. The massive black bear stood motionless beneath the towering pines. His thick fur dusted with snow. But something was wrong. His stance was tense, his breathing labored. His dark eyes met hers, and in them, she saw something she had never seen before. Panic. Boris let out another deep, rumbling cry, and then turned, disappearing into the trees. Elena didn't hesitate. Grabbing her flashlight, she followed. A terrible discovery. Boris led her through the dense undergrowth, moving faster than she had ever seen him move. She struggled to keep up, her breath coming in short gasps as the cold air burned her lungs. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a clearing. Elena's heart stopped. Natasha and Misha were there, their massive forms hunched over something in the snow. And in the center of the clearing, lying motionless against the frozen ground, was another bear. A cub. Elena rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the small, trembling creature. Its fur was matted with ice. Its breathing shallow. She reached out a hand, and the cub whimpered, curling in on itself. It was barely alive. She looked up at Boris, her eyes questioning. Where had this cub come from? Was it one of theirs? Had they found it abandoned? Boris let out a deep, guttural sound, stepping closer, his massive head hovering over the tiny bear. His dark eyes met hers again, filled with something she could only describe as urgency. They needed her help. Without another thought, she scooped the cub into her arms. A fight for survival. Elena moved quickly, carrying the fragile creature back to her cabin with Boris, Natasha, and Misha close behind. She stoked the fire, wrapping the cub in warm blankets, rubbing its fur to restore circulation. It was dangerously weak, its small body barely responding. She had nursed animals back to health before, but never a bear cub. Throughout the night, she sat by the fire, feeding it small amounts of warm milk, whispering reassurances as it trembled in her hands. The 3 adult bears waited outside, pacing restlessly, peering through the windows as if watching over both of them. By dawn, the cub stirred. Its eyes flickered open, and a tiny, weak sound escaped its throat. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was going to survive. But then, a new question formed in her mind. Where had this cub come from? Secrets beneath the ice. As the days passed, the cub grew stronger, and the bears remained. They never left her cabin, standing guard as if protecting both Elena and the small orphan. And then, one evening, as Elena stepped outside to check on them, Boris did something he had never done before. He nudged her. Not in a playful way. Not in an affectionate way. In a way that said, "Come with me." Elena hesitated for only a moment before following. Boris led her deep into the forest, past the old trails, further than she had ever gone before. The snow-covered ground became rougher, the trees twisted and gnarled. And then, in the distance, she saw it. A cave. It was partially hidden by fallen trees, its entrance barely visible. But as Boris moved forward, pushing aside the branches, Elena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Something wasn't right. The moment she stepped inside, she saw why. The cave wasn't just a natural formation. Its walls were lined with something unnatural, something metallic, half buried beneath the ice and rock. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. These were remnants of something old. Something man-made. And then, at the very back of the cave, she saw them. More bear cubs. 3 of them, huddled together, too weak to move. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just an abandoned den. This was a place where something had happened. And the bears had brought her here for a reason. Elena turned to Boris, her heart hammering. "What is this place?" she whispered. Though she knew he couldn't answer. But in his eyes, she saw the truth. The bears had been watching. They had always been watching. And now, they were trusting her with a secret buried deeper than the ice. A new beginning. With careful hands, Elena carried the cubs back to the warmth of her cabin. As she worked to save them, as she pieced together the mystery of the cave, a single thought kept circling in her mind. The bears had saved her life more times than she could count. Now, it was her turn to save theirs. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was only the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The morning after Elena discovered the cave, she awoke to a profound silence. Outside her cabin, the forest stood frozen in an eerie stillness, as if holding its breath. The 3 rescued cubs nestled in thick blankets by the fire. Their tiny bodies finally at rest after a night of care. Boris, Natasha, and Misha lingered near the tree lean, their massive forms silhouetted against the pale dawn. They had been waiting. Watching. For years, she had known these bears as guardians, protectors of her home, of her life. But now, she realized something deeper was at play. They weren't just here out of instinct or gratitude. They were guiding her toward something. And that terrified her more than anything. The hidden past. Elena's mind kept returning to the cave. It wasn't just a den. The metal fragments. The unnatural smoothness of the walls, it was a sight. And someone had tried to hide it. After ensuring the cubs were stable, she bundled herself in heavy furs and packed a satchel with supplies, her lantern, a thick rope, and a hunting knife she never thought she'd have to use. Then, she turned to Boris. "Show me," she said, her voice firm despite the cold knot in her stomach. Boris grunted, turning toward the forest. She followed. The descent into the unknown. The cave was exactly as she had left it, shrouded in ice, half consumed by the elements. But in the daylight, she noticed something new. Scratch marks on the rock. Not from bears. From tools. Someone had been here before. She touched the jagged metal jutting out from the frozen ground. It was old, rusted, but beneath the decay, she could make out faint markings. A symbol. Not just any symbol. A military emblem. Elena swallowed hard. Siberia had long been a place of forgotten secrets, Cold War experiments. Abandoned bunkers, whispers of things lost to time. Was this one of them? She moved deeper, tracing her fingers along the metal, brushing away layers of frost. And then she saw it. A door. Not natural. Not something formed by time. A sealed metal hatch, embedded into the cavern floor. Her pulse pounded. She turned back to Boris, Natasha, and Misha. They watched her. Waiting. As if they already knew what lay beneath. Taking a deep breath, Elena placed both hands against the icy surface and pushed. The awakening. At first, nothing happened. Then, a low hiss escaped from beneath the ice. The metal shuddered. And before she could react, the ground beneath her gave way. Elena plunged downward, swallowed by the darkness. When she awoke, her head ached, her vision swimming. The air was different, warmer, thick with the scent of something unnatural. Groaning, she pushed herself up. She was inside. And what she saw made her breath catch. The walls were lined with panels, blinking faintly with faded blue light. The ceiling curved in smooth, seamless metal. This wasn't a natural cavern. It was a facility. An underground installation, buried beneath decades of ice. Elena took a cautious step forward. Dust coated the floor, but scattered among it were footprints, not human, but massive paw prints, leading deeper into the complex. She shuddered. The bears had been here before. The ghosts of the past. Moving carefully, Elena followed the trail. Every step sent echoes through the abandoned corridors. The weight of history pressing against her shoulders. Faded documents littered the ground, their pages yellowed with time. She picked one up, her hands shaking as she read. Project Deadless. Date, 1964. Status, classified. Her heart pounded. A government project. A forgotten one. She moved to a rusted file cabinet, prying it open with her knife. More files. Reports. Notes scribbled in hurried handwriting. Then, a photograph. It was grainy, but she could make out the image. A man in a military uniform, standing beside a bear cub. Not just any cub. A cub wearing a metallic collar, similar to the one she had seen Boris wear before it had fallen apart with age. Her blood ran cold. The bears weren't just wild animals. They had been part of something. And whatever that something was, it hadn't been meant to be found. The truth that should have stayed buried. A noise echoed behind her. A deep, familiar rumble. Elena turned. Boris stood at the threshold, his dark eyes filled with something she couldn't name. Understanding. Regret. She stepped toward him, holding up the photograph. "What is this?" she whispered. Boris didn't answer. But she already knew. These bears had once been more than just animals. They had been created. Not by nature, but by men. And now, those men were long gone. The bears were all that remained. And they had been trying to protect something. But from who? The choice. Elena clenched the photograph in her hand. She could leave. Forget she had ever found this place. Or she could dig deeper. Find out the truth. Expose the past that had been buried beneath the ice. She turned to Boris, her decision made. "I'm staying," she said. The bear let out a deep breath. Then turned, leading her further into the darkness. And somewhere in the silence, beneath layers of ice and history, something else stirred. Something that had been waiting for far too long. Elena's breath echoed in the hollow underground corridors, her pulse hammering like a drumbeat. The air was thick with the weight of history, a silence that spoke of secrets buried beneath the ice for decades. Boris led the way, his massive paws making no sound on the cold steel flooring. Natasha and Misha flanked her sides, their hulking forms acting as both guardians and guides. She clutched the faded Project Deadless file. Her fingers shaking. What had they done here? And why were the bears trying to show her? The labyrinth below. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, branching into side chambers filled with rusting equipment. Faint lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Elena ran her fingers along the metal, feeling the chill of something long abandoned. A door stood ajar at the far end of the corridor. Unlike the others, it was reinforced, its surface marred with deep claw marks, marks that could have only come from bears. She stepped inside. The room was a lab. Rows of shattered test tubes lined the walls. Metal gurneys covered in dust. Large viewing windows overlooked containment cells, empty now, but their thick steel bars and reinforced locks suggested whatever had once been inside had never meant to leave. Her stomach clenched. She turned to a terminal, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing. Swallowing her fear, she pressed a button. Static. Then, a video feed crackled to life. A young man in a lab coat appeared on the screen. His eyes were wild, his voice shaking. "This is Dr. Anton Volkov, lead researcher of Project Deadless. If you're watching this, it means we failed. Elena's breath hitched. They were supposed to be guardians. Sentinels of the tundra, genetically enhanced to protect remote government sites. But we pushed them too far. We underestimated their intelligence. Their memory. Their ability to adapt. The camera shook as a deep roar rumbled in the background. They were never supposed to survive without us. But they did. And now they are more than we ever intended. A metallic crash sounded in the recording. Volkov turned, panic flashing across his face. If you find this, do not interfere. They are watching. They are always watching. The feed cut to static. Elena's skin prickled. She turned to Boris, her mind racing. They had been experiments. Created, trained, and then abandoned. But they hadn't died. They had evolved. The truth in their eyes. She met Boris's gaze. The intelligence in his dark eyes wasn't just from instinct. It was learned. Passed down. Generation after generation. Elena swallowed. The bears hadn't just come to her out of gratitude. They had been waiting. Waiting for someone to understand. She exhaled slowly. The government had tried to erase them. Tried to bury the past beneath the ice. But the bears had endured. And now, she was the only human who knew. The arrival. A distant rumbling shook the underground chamber. Elena stiffened. Not an earthquake. Engines. She turned to the control panel, hands flying across the buttons. The monitors flickered, revealing grainy footage of the surface above. Black military vehicles plowed through the snow. Men in combat gear disembarked, their rifles gleaming in the morning light. Her stomach dropped. They had come for the secret. They had come for the bears. The final choice. Elena's hands curled into fists. She had a choice. She could run, escape through the tunnels before the soldiers reached her. Or she could fight. Not with weapons. But with truth. She turned to Boris, her decision made. "We don't hide anymore," she whispered. The bear let out a deep, rumbling growl, a sound not of anger, but understanding. The time for secrets was over. And the battle for the past had just begun. The earth trembled under the weight of approaching danger. The low hum of military vehicles vibrated through the icy air, sending waves of unease through Elena's body. She stood at the entrance of the underground facility. Boris, Natasha, and Misha flanking her, their deep, intelligent eyes locked onto the snow-laden horizon where the black armored trucks had stopped. The government had come. Not to protect. Not to understand. But to erase. The last stand. The first soldier emerged from the convoy, his breath clouding in the frigid air. More followed, a dozen men clad in tactical gear. Rifles raised, their eyes scanning the terrain like predators. Elena's heart pounded. "Dr. Dawson." A voice rang out over a loudspeaker. "Step away from the bears and surrender immediately. This is a classified operation." She clenched her fists. "They are not an operation," she called back, voice strong despite the fear curling in her chest. "They are sentient. They saved lives. And you abandoned them." Silence. A man stepped forward from the ranks, his uniform marked with the insignia of high command. Colonel Vasily Petrov. "Elena. Listen to me," he said, his voice calculated, controlled. "You don't understand what you found here." She laughed, bitter and sharp. "I understand better than you ever did." She shot back. "You tried to create weapons, but instead, you created something greater. They are more than just enhanced creatures. They are guardians. The soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons. And then, the snow moved. At first, it was barely perceptible. A shift. A ripple across the landscape. Then, shadows emerged. More bears, massive, powerful, stepping out from the hidden depths of the forest. 10. 15. A clan of grizzlies, each one more magnificent than the last. Their fur dusted with snow, their breath forming misty plumes in the cold. The soldiers faltered. Some stepped back. These weren't just wild animals. These were the descendants of Project Deadless. They had been watching. Waiting. And now, they had come. The choice. Colonel Petrov's face paled. "We need to contain this situation," he muttered into his radio. The moment stretched, teetering on the edge of violence. Elena knew what would happen next. A single shot. And then, war. She took a step forward, raising her hands. "You don't need to do this." Petrov's gaze flickered with something close to doubt. "You saw what happened in the lab," she pressed. "You read the reports. They aren't just animals anymore. They have memory. They have instinct. But more than that, they have choice." The grizzlies stood their ground, watching the humans with unflinching, measured intelligence. A standoff. Two species. Two possible futures. The future they chose. Petrov exhaled sharply. Then, he did the unthinkable. He lowered his weapon. "Stand down," he commanded. The soldiers hesitated. "I said stand down." Slowly, reluctantly, the men dropped their rifles. The air shifted, the tension breaking like ice beneath the sun. The bears did not attack. They did not flee. They simply watched, as if knowing they had just won their freedom. Petrov turned to Elena, his expression unreadable. "I'll be filing my report. But this place, it never existed." She nodded. Some battles were fought with weapons. Others were won with understanding. The guardians remain. The soldiers left, their tire tracks vanishing beneath fresh snowfall. The hidden base, the long-forgotten project, and the bear's true nature would never reach the outside world. Elena stayed behind for a while, watching as Boris, Natasha, and Misha returned to the depths of the wilderness. They paused, looking back at her one last time. A silent promise. A bond unbroken. And then, they were gone. The guardians of the ice. Forever watching. Forever free. Epilogue. Years later, whispers of giant, intelligent bears roaming the Siberian wilds would surface. Hunters spoke of creatures that recognized them. Locals told tales of bears leading lost travelers to safety. Elena never confirmed nor denied these stories. But sometimes, on the coldest of nights, she would step outside her cabin, the wind howling through the trees. And in the distance, just beyond the veil of snow, she would see them. Standing. Watching. Protecting. And she would smile. Because she knew. Some legends were meant to live on. Forever. Lessons from the guardians of the ice. The story of Elena and the intelligent bears is more than just an extraordinary tale of survival. Science, and mystery, it is a profound reflection on the connection between humans and nature, the power of compassion, and the ethical responsibilities we bear toward the world around us. Here are some key humanistic lessons drawn from their journey. 1. Compassion creates unbreakable bonds. Elena did not see the bears as mere animals or scientific subjects, she saw them as beings with intelligence, emotions, and a right to exist. Her decision to save them, despite the risks, was driven by empathy rather than self-interest. This teaches us that acts of kindness, no matter how small, have the potential to create lifelong bonds. When we choose to help without expecting anything in return, we often receive the most profound rewards: loyalty, gratitude, and sometimes even miracles. Lesson: kindness is not weakness, it is the strongest force in the universe. 2. Nature is not our enemy, but our teacher. The bears, once engineered for human purposes, became something far greater than what their creators had intended. They adapted, evolved, and learned to navigate the world on their own terms, not as weapons, but as protectors of the land they called home. This reflects a deep truth: nature is not something to conquer or control, but something to learn from. Animals, like humans, have instincts, intelligence, and an inherent right to live freely. Lesson: the more we respect nature, the more it reveals its wisdom to us. 3. Fear and violence are easy choices, understanding takes strength. When confronted by government forces, Elena and the bears could have fought back, escalating the conflict. Instead, they stood their ground without resorting to aggression. In the end, understanding and recognition won over brute force. This is a powerful lesson for humanity. So often, we respond to fear with hostility. But sometimes, choosing peace is the greatest act of courage. Lesson: violence may bring temporary victories, but understanding builds legacies. 4. True guardianship is selfless. The bears could have disappeared into the wilderness, forgetting Elena and living for themselves. Yet, time and time again, they returned, watching over her, guiding her, ensuring her safety even when she was unaware. This speaks to the essence of guardianship. True protectors do not seek power or recognition. They act out of love and duty. Whether it is for family, friends, or even strangers, real guardians give without expecting anything in return. Lesson: those who protect others without seeking reward leave behind an unshakable legacy. 5. The greatest secrets are not hidden in bunkers, but in the heart. At the heart of this story is not just a government conspiracy or a secret experiment, it is a story about the capacity for life to evolve beyond what we understand. The true secret was not buried underground, it was the bond between Elena and the bears, a bond that defied science, logic, and expectation. It reminds us that some of the most profound truths in life cannot be measured in labs or contained in reports. They are felt. They are lived. They are experienced through love, trust, and faith in the unknown. Lesson: the most powerful forces in the world are invisible: love, loyalty, and the unspoken connection between souls. Final thought: we are all guardians. Whether we realize it or not, we all have a role as guardians, of nature, of one another, of the values that make us human. Elena saved the bears. The bears saved Elena. And in the end, they saved something much greater. A belief that kindness, even in the face of fear and uncertainty, is never in vain. So the next time you face a choice, to ignore, to destroy, or to protect, choose wisely. Because what we choose to protect today will define the world of tomorrow.